The mountains of Grey Reach were known as a place where sound died quickly and fear lived long, a nesting ground for one of the oldest dragon broods still active in the age of humans. And when the alarms rang through the stone caverns that night, it was not the sound of intrusion that terrified the brood parents most, but silence. The eggs had hatched weeks earlier, 3 small dragonlings born fragile and curious, their fire weak, their wings untested, guarded obsessively by their mother and father because the world beyond the cavern mouth had learned long ago to fear dragons and to kill their young when given the chance. A storm had rolled in hard and sudden that evening, shaking the mountains with thunder and forcing the brood parents to take flight to reinforce outer wards against hunters and rival beasts drawn by the scent of newborn flame. And they had left their hatchlings for only minutes, only moments, trusting ancient stone and layered magic to be enough. When they returned, the wards were broken, the cavern floor disturbed, and the nest was empty. No blood, no scorch marks, no remains. Only the echo of small claw marks leading away into the mountain paths where humans sometimes traveled. Panic unlike any battlefield terror seized them, a raw, animal fear that stripped away millennia of dominance and left only the certainty that their children were gone and likely dead, taken by a species known for cruelty born of fear. The mother's roar shattered stalactites as she searched the tunnels. The father's fire scorched the mountainside in blind rage, and every story they had ever told themselves about humans ended the same way. Small dragons did not survive human hands. Far below, in a weather-worn shepherd's hut tucked against the slope, a man named Elric sat awake by a dying fire, his simple life defined by goats, wind, and long nights of solitude after a war that had taken everything else from him. He had not gone looking for dragons. He had found 3 trembling shapes half frozen in the storm, tangled in brush, their tiny bodies radiating heat but shaking violently, eyes wide with panic, fire sputtering dangerously as fear threatened to burn them from the inside out. Elric had known, in that instant, that helping them might mean death, but he also knew what untreated shock looked like, knew what cold did to small bodies, and knew that if he walked away, they would not last the night. He wrapped them instinctively in his cloak and carried them home, ignoring the sting of small flames against his skin, murmuring nonsense words the way he once had to frighten soldiers and crying children, settling back in his chair and opening his shirt without thinking so the warmth of his chest could steady their breathing. One by one, the dragonlings quieted, their erratic fire dimming, claws loosening as they curled instinctively against the steady rise and fall of a human heartbeat, something ancient in them recognizing safety even as their instincts screamed otherwise. When the brood parents finally traced the trail to the hut, they did not burst in roaring. They crept, dread thick in their throats, already bracing themselves for the sight of torn bodies or trophies taken apart by human cruelty. What they saw instead broke something fundamental inside them. A human seated in the dim light, eyes closed from exhaustion, arms relaxed, 3 dragonlings asleep on his bare chest as if they had always belonged there. Their small wings draped over his shoulders, their fire completely extinguished, the room warm but unburned. The mother froze, unable to reconcile the image with every truth she had ever known, while the father's claws dug into stone as he fought the instinct to kill first and ask later, because one wrong move could wake the hatchlings into panic. Time stretched painfully as they watched the rise and fall of the human's breathing synchronize with their children's, watched how instinctively his hands shifted when one stirred, shielding rather than restraining, and slowly, terrifyingly, the certainty of what they had expected to find gave way to something far worse and far more dangerous. Doubt. Elric woke to the sound of stone groaning under weight, eyes snapping open to the unmistakable presence of death inches away, and for a moment, all he felt was regret. Not for himself, but for the sudden spike of fear that rippled through the dragonlings as they sensed their parents. He did not reach for a weapon. He did not move at all, knowing that any sudden motion would undo everything. He spoke softly, voice rough with exhaustion, telling the dragons exactly what he had done and why, offering no defense beyond truth, prepared to die as long as the hatchlings lived. The brood parents listened, stunned not by his words but by the fact that their children did not flee when he spoke, did not ignite in panic, but only shifted closer, trusting a human body as warmth rather than threat. In that impossible moment, as storm winds howled outside and ancient hatred hovered on a knife's edge, the dragons realized they had braced for the wrong horror. Not the death of their young, but the shattering of everything they believed about the creatures they had ruled through fear for ages. The silence that followed Elric's explanation stretched so long it became unbearable, heavy with the weight of instincts screaming for blood and a reality that refused to align with them, and the brood-parents found themselves frozen between what dragons had always done and what their eyes were now forcing them to understand. The father's wings twitched, each muscle coiled for violence. Yet every time he shifted his weight, one of the dragonlings stirred, tiny claws flexing against the human skin, and the soft whine of half-sleeping distress cut deeper than any blade could have. The mother, older and sharper-eyed, noticed details that made her chest ache in ways she had no name for. The burns on Elric's collarbone where uncontrolled infant fire had licked too close, the way his breathing stayed slow and deliberate despite the terror. He must have felt waking to two full-grown dragons looming over him, the absence of chains, cages, or restraints anywhere in the hut. This was not a hunter's den, not a trophy room, not a place of cruelty, but a poor shelter built for survival, smelling of smoke, wool, and loneliness. Elric did not avert his gaze or bow, not out of disrespect but because moving would risk waking the hatchlings fully, and so he spoke only when one of them whimpered, murmuring reassurance with a tenderness that made the mother's throat tighten painfully. Dragons knew the sound of control, of command, of dominance, but this was something else entirely, something that asked nothing in return. Slowly, impossibly, the mother lowered her massive head until her snout rested against the edge of the table, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from her children and from the human who had become their shelter. And when one dragonling sleepily reached out and pressed its forehead against her scales without waking, a tremor ran through her that no battle had ever caused. The father felt it too, the fracture spreading through certainty, because in that moment he understood that if this human had wanted to harm their young, they would already be dead, and if he wanted leverage, he would have woken them screaming long before the parents arrived. Instead, Elric had chosen the most dangerous option possible for himself, doing nothing that might frighten them, even when his life hung in the balance. Hours passed in that impossible standoff, night giving way to the first pale hint of dawn, and still no one moved to claim the obvious outcome, because no one knew how to step forward without breaking what had formed. When the smallest dragonling finally woke fully, blinking blearily and releasing a tiny puff of harmless heat, it did not cry out or recoil at the sight of its parents. It yawned, stretched its wings, and settled again, as if the strange gathering of scale and flesh were the most natural thing in the world. That, more than anything, undid the father. With infinite care, he folded his wings and lowered himself to the floor, reducing his size, his threat showing submission not to the human, but to the moment, and in doing so made a choice that would echo far beyond that hut. Elric felt the shift even before he saw it, tension easing just enough that he dared to lift one hand slowly, clearly, so the parents could see the burns and tremor there, proof not of strength but of cost, and he spoke again, explaining the storm, the cold, the fear that had driven the hatchling's fire out of control, explaining that he had lost children of his own once and recognized that look in their eyes immediately. He did not say the word war, but the dragons heard it anyway, felt the shared weight of loss settle between them like a bridge neither had expected to find. The mother finally spoke, her voice low and resonant, asking why he had not taken them to authorities, to hunters, to anyone who might reward him, and Elric answered simply that no one else would have seen them as children first, and that had been the only thing that mattered in the moment. The dragonlings began to wake in earnest then, stretching and churring, climbing clumsily over Elric's chest and shoulders, their parents watching every movement with held breath, ready to intervene if fear sparked, but it never did. Instead, the babies toddled between human and dragon without distinction, warmth and safety defined not by species but by presence, and something ancient shifted deep within the brood-parents as they realized their young were learning a different definition of threat and comfort than any dragon generation before them. When the time came to take the hatchlings home, it was not done with force or urgency. Elric gently guided them into their mother's reach, one by one, his hands lingering only long enough to steady them, and when the last left his chest, the cold hit him suddenly, violently, because he had not noticed how much warmth they had taken with them. The father watched that reaction, the involuntary shiver, and understood with startling clarity that this human had not been protected by courage alone, but by vulnerability willingly accepted. Before leaving, the mother did something no dragon had ever done in recorded memory. She inclined her head to a human, not in dominance or warning, but in acknowledgement, promising that the debt would be remembered, that her children would carry this moment in their bones. As they departed into the brightening sky, Elric sank back into his chair, exhausted beyond words, convinced that this was the end of it, a strange miracle that would fade into memory like smoke. He did not yet know that the broodparents, carrying their unharmed children home, were already bracing themselves for a far more terrifying realization than finding their babies dead. That they would never again be able to see humans as monsters without remembering the warmth of a human chest that had kept dragon hearts beating through the coldest night. In the weeks that followed, the broodparents discovered that survival does not end a crisis. It begins one, because once a belief fractures, it does not neatly reseal, and everywhere they turned, the memory of a human heartbeat beneath their children's sleep followed them like an echo they could not silence. The dragonlings returned to their cavern nest unchanged in body but altered in ways far harder to measure, no longer reacting to unfamiliar scents with immediate panic, no longer flaring uncontrolled fire at every unexpected sound. And when human travelers passed the lower mountain paths, the young ones tilted their heads in curiosity rather than recoiling in instinctive hatred. The mother watched these changes with a mix of wonder and dread, knowing how fiercely dragon society guarded tradition, knowing that deviation, especially one influenced by humans, was often treated as corruption rather than growth. The father, more combative by nature, tried at first to correct what he saw as weakness, encouraging dominance displays, controlled intimidation, ritualized fear responses, yet each attempt unraveled in quiet defiance, because the hatchlings simply did not respond the way dragon young were supposed to. They learned fire control faster through calm repetition than through pressure, responded to guidance rather than threat, and most unsettling of all, sought proximity instead of hierarchy when uncertain. Word spread among nearby broods that something was different in Grey Reach, that 3 hatchlings had been taken by a human and returned unharmed, and reactions ranged from disbelief to fury, because if such a thing were possible, then centuries of justification trembled on unstable ground. Elder dragons came to observe under the pretense of concern, circling the cavern in silence, scrutinizing the young for signs of manipulation, curse, or hidden obedience, yet they found none, only healthy dragonlings whose instincts no longer aligned perfectly with fear-based doctrine. Whispers sharpened into accusation, and it was only a matter of time before the question was asked openly. Should the human be eliminated to prevent further contamination? The suggestion ignited a fierce argument among the broodparents, because the thought of erasing Elric no longer felt like correction. It felt like betrayal of a truth their children carried now, one that could not be burned away without consequence. Against tradition and caution, the mother made a choice that would have been unthinkable months earlier. She returned alone to the human lands, not in secret, not under threat, but openly, wings folded, fire restrained, landing near the shepherd's hut in daylight where humans could see and flee if they wished. Elric, who had resumed his quiet life with aching bones and lingering burns, nearly collapsed at the sight of her silhouette against the sky, because fear does not vanish simply because one survives it once. Yet he did not run, not this time either. The dragon spoke not as a ruler but as a parent, telling him of the changes, the scrutiny, the danger her children now faced not from humans but from their own kind, and for the first time Elric understood the full weight of what he had done, that saving 3 lives had disrupted an entire framework of inherited hatred. He did not offer solutions or promises. He offered presence, the same thing he had given in the storm, agreeing to meet the brood in neutral ground where both species could observe without threat. The meeting that followed was tense beyond measure, dragons coiled and alert, humans hidden but watching from a distance, and in the center, 3 dragonlings toddling between stone and grass, unafraid, their parents holding their breath as the young approached Elric on their own, climbing into his lap with the same instinctive trust that had first ignited this chain of consequences. No commands were given, no displays forced, and that absence spoke louder than any roar, because for the first time, dragons witnessed human restraint without submission, human gentleness without leverage. Elders argued fiercely afterward, some insisting this proved humans were capable of manipulation through softness, others struggling to deny what their own senses had observed. And while no consensus was reached, something irreversible had occurred, the existence of an exception. In dragon society, exceptions were dangerous because they demanded explanation, and explanation often led to change. Elric returned home shaken but alive, unaware that his name was now spoken in cavern councils, not as prey or tool, but as anomaly, a variable that could not be neatly categorized. The brood parents watched their children grow, carrying both pride and fear, knowing that these hatchlings would one day challenge assumptions simply by existing. And when the smallest began mimicking Elric's calming murmurs while soothing a frightened sibling, the mother felt tears burn behind her eyes, because that sound did not belong to dragons, yet it belonged to her child now. Far away, in human settlements, rumors shifted tone as well. Stories spread not of slaughter or terror, but of a man who had held dragon babies and lived, a narrative that softened fear into cautious curiosity, just enough to slow the cycle of preemptive violence. No treaties were signed, no proclamations made, but a subtle recalibration rippled outward, altering how patrols responded, how hunters hesitated, how parents told bedtime stories. Both species stood on the edge of something fragile and unnamed, bound together not by alliance or dominance, but by shared vulnerability revealed in the most dangerous way possible. And in the quiet moments, when the brood parents watched their children sleep curled together, fire dim and controlled, they understood the most terrifying truth of all. The world their young would inherit would not be governed by the certainty of fear, and there would be no going back to the simplicity of hatred once you had seen your children choose warmth over instinct. The reckoning came not as a sudden war, but as a slow convergence of choices finally colliding, because a world can carry contradiction only so long before it must decide what kind of future it will tolerate. Months after the storm, when the dragonlings had grown stronger and their presence alone had become a quiet provocation, a council of elder broods gathered in Grey Reach, summoned by unrest that could no longer be contained by silence. They came prepared to enforce tradition if needed, to demand correction, to excise what they still called an aberration. And the brood parents knew that this meeting would determine whether their children would be allowed to grow into themselves or be broken back into conformity. Humans, sensing danger through rumor rather than decree, stayed away from the mountains except for one, because Elric understood something the elders did not, that absence would be interpreted as guilt, and fear thrives where witnesses refuse to stand. He arrived alone, unarmed, older now, scars still visible, heart pounding so hard it felt like an answer to a challenge he had never issued. And when he stepped into the open stone basin where dragons coiled like living cliffs, the air tightened with barely restrained violence. The elders spoke of precedent, of balance, of the danger of allowing humans to influence dragon young, invoking centuries of bloodshed as proof that separation and dominance were necessary evils. And when Elric was finally permitted to speak, it was not to defend himself, but to ask a single, devastating question: whether the elders truly believed that the survival of their species depended on fear learned before understanding. The dragonlings, now large enough to walk with confidence, listened from the edge of the basin, their parents rigid with tension, and when the smallest stepped forward unbidden, pressing close to Elric's leg in a gesture so simple and unguarded that it cut through the rhetoric like fire through ice, the council fractured. Some elders roared in outrage, others fell into stunned silence, because no command had been given, no coercion applied, and yet the choice had been made openly. What followed was not consensus but exhaustion, the slow realization that enforcing the old way would require violence not against an enemy, but against the visible will of their own young, and that cost suddenly seemed higher than tradition had ever accounted for. The elders did not bless the change. They allowed it, and that allowance became the most powerful decision of the age, because it acknowledged that control was no longer absolute. From that day on, the brood parents were not hunted or censured, but watched. Their children studied rather than corrected, and as seasons passed, the feared catastrophe never arrived. Instead, interactions shifted in small, cumulative ways. Patrols hesitated before striking isolated humans. Humans learned to signal intent rather than panic, and conflict, when it occurred, was no longer inevitable. Elric returned to his hut and lived out his days without fame or protection, occasionally visited by dragons who did not speak of debts or power, but of questions, seeking to understand what it meant to offer safety without dominance. When he died quietly one winter, the mountains did not burn in mourning, but dragons circled high above in silence, and the brood parents brought their grown children to the place where warmth had once been shared, letting them feel the echo of a heartbeat that had changed their fate. In time, historians of both species would argue over when the age of reflexive hatred truly ended, but among dragons who remembered, the answer was simple and unromantic. It ended the night they braced to find their babies dead and instead found them asleep on a human's chest. Because once you have seen your greatest fear proven wrong by gentleness, fear loses its claim to truth. And that, more than treaties or wars or proclamations, became the quiet foundation of a future where power was no longer measured only by the ability to destroy, but by the courage to hold something fragile and choose not to.